A black woman in special forces? Kid, stop lying. The words hit Jada Carter like a punch to the chest. Derek Simmons, an off-duty Atlanta police officer, stood leaning against a rack of jackets, his voice dripping with sarcasm and disbelief. His mocking laugh cut through the air, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. A few shoppers turned, whispering, their curiosity instantly drawn to the tension building inside the REI store at Lenox Square Mall. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe every child deserves respect, like and subscribe for more stories like this. Now, let's begin. Jada Carter was only 13, but in that moment, she felt every pair of eyes in the store on her. Her small hands tightened around the shoebox she held, knuckles pale, breath stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. Just seconds ago, she'd been laughing with her best friend, Maya Evans, about school, sneakers, and summer plans. But then, in one careless moment, her casual pride about her mom's job became the spark that lit this fire. "My mom's Major General Lauren Carter," Jada had said proudly, her voice steady and sure. "She's in the U.S. Army Special Forces." Maya's jaw had dropped, and so had Simmons's laugh. "Special Forces," he said again, louder now, almost performing for the small crowd that was slowly forming. "Kid, I've been a cop longer than you've been alive. I've worked with soldiers, trained with some of them. You expect me to believe your mom's kicking doors with the best of the best? Be serious." His tone wasn't just disbelief, it was dismissal. It carried something heavier, unspoken but sharp, like he'd already decided someone like Jada's mom couldn't possibly hold that rank, couldn't possibly belong in that world. The sting wasn't just in his words, it was in the way he laughed, like the very idea was ridiculous. Jada's cheeks burned, heat crawling up her neck, but she refused to look away. She swallowed hard, blinked back the sting of humiliation, and said softly, "It's true. She's Major General Lauren Carter. She's stationed at Fort Moore right now." Simmons chuckled, shaking his head like he was indulging a silly child. "Sure. And I'm Captain America," he said, folding his arms across his chest, his badge flashing under the bright store lights. "Look, kid, I've been around real operators. I've seen the grind, the training, the blood, the years it takes to make it. You're telling me your mom's out there leading Special Forces missions? Cute story. But come on." Around them, the murmurs started. A woman holding her toddler paused, pretending to look at hiking jackets while subtly leaning closer. A group of college students whispered, their phones already angled, ready to record what they sensed might turn into something big. Jada felt it, the shift in the room, the weight of strangers watching. Every second of silence stretched, every breath louder in her ears. Maya stepped closer, gently touching Jada's arm. "Just ignore him," she whispered, her voice urgent but soft. "We don't have to explain anything to him." But Jada shook her head. Her throat was tight, but her voice carried something fierce when she spoke again. "She's done more than you can imagine," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "She's been in the Army for 25 years. She's led missions in Jordan, Afghanistan, and places I can't even say because they're classified." Simmons raised a brow, smirking like he was being challenged. "Classified, huh?" "That's convenient," he said, chuckling as though the word itself was a punchline. "Listen, kid, let me explain something to you about how the real world works. People talk big when they want to impress. But Special Forces? That's not for everyone. And between you and me, they don't hand out stars like candy. It takes more than stories." He stopped short, biting off the end of his sentence. But the implication hung heavy in the air. Jada heard it. Maya heard it. And so did the onlookers. It wasn't just skepticism anymore. It was prejudice, buried beneath a thin veneer of authority. "You don't know her," Jada said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "You don't know what she's done." Simmons shrugged, unconcerned. "I know enough to know what's believable," he said, tilting his head, the condescension curling in his tone like smoke. "Tell you what, kid, if your mom's really this big deal you say she is, why isn't she here? Where's this so-called general?" He grinned like he'd scored a point, like the absence of Jada's mother was all the proof he needed. The crowd shifted, some people avoiding eye contact, others leaning in closer, drawn to the tension they couldn't look away from. Jada's chest tightened, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. She thought about the shadow box in their living room, lined with rows of her mom's medals: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Medal, all proof of battles fought and leadership earned. But in that moment, with Simmons's smug voice ringing through the air, it felt like none of it mattered. Maya tugged gently at her sleeve. "Jada, let's just go," she whispered again, trying to shield her friend from the growing humiliation. But Jada stood her ground. Her mother had taught her better than to shrink. "She doesn't have to be here for it to be true," Jada said finally, her voice cracking on the last word but refusing to break. Simmons laughed again, louder this time, drawing more attention. "All right, kid," he said, his smirk deepening. "I'll play along. Let's see if this legendary general of yours comes marching through those doors to save the day." A ripple of laughter ran through a few members of the crowd, small but sharp, like tiny cuts layered on top of each other. Jada swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the shoebox. "She's coming," she whispered, barely audible, more to herself than to him. Simmons chuckled one last time, leaning back casually against the display rack, fully confident he was right. "Sure. Kid, I'll wait," he said, his voice carrying the weight of arrogance, ignorance, and authority all at once, and in that moment, with every eye on her and every whisper growing louder. Jada Carter made a silent promise to herself. She would stand her ground, no matter how small her voice felt. The REI store felt smaller now, its bright fluorescent lights suddenly harsher, trapping Jada Carter in the center of a moment she wished she could escape. Yet something inside her refused to move, refused to give Simmons the satisfaction of watching her walk away in defeat. She held the shoebox tighter, her knuckles pale, her breath shallow, her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the hum of distant conversations as Derek Simmons leaned back against the backpack display. His arms folded across his chest like a judge waiting for her to plead guilty to something she hadn't done. His smirk deepening with every second that passed. "You know, kid," he said casually, his voice pitched just loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "In my 18 years on the force, I've met plenty of soldiers, real ones, the kind who crawl through mud, jump out of planes, and bleed for their teams. And let me tell you, not one of them looked anything like the picture you're trying to paint." His words carried a weight he didn't bother to hide, the unspoken implication sharp enough to slice through the air, and Jada heard it as clearly as if he'd shouted it outright. Her chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat, but she forced herself to swallow it down. Because walking away would mean letting him rewrite her mother's story, letting him take something sacred and turn it into a joke for strangers to laugh at. And she couldn't. She wouldn't. Let that happen. Not after everything her mom had sacrificed to earn the rank she carried with quiet dignity. Maya Evans, standing firmly at Jada's side, shifted nervously, her braids brushing her shoulders as she glanced around the crowd that had nearly doubled in size now. College students whispered behind their phones, the glow of recording screens reflecting in their eyes. A mother bounced a restless toddler on her hip while pretending to browse, and an older man in a baseball cap crossed his arms, muttering under his breath but not loud enough to challenge Simmons outright. Nobody stepped in. Nobody stopped him. And that silence only emboldened him further. "I mean, come on," Simmons continued, pushing himself off the display and taking a step closer, his badge glinting in the store's light, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. You're 13, right? Kids your age like to dream big. I get it. But Special Forces? Major General? That's top 1% of the 1%. Kid, you don't just stroll into that. And let's be real. No one's buying this fairy tale. Jada's lips parted. But no words came at first. Her voice felt trapped somewhere deep in her chest, squeezed tight by the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. But then she remembered the late nights when her mom came home exhausted, yet proud. The way Lauren Carter's eyes softened when she spoke about her team, her missions, her soldiers, and how much she carried on her shoulders. You don't know her, Jada said finally, her voice quiet but steady, trembling only at the edges. You don't know what she's done, where she's been, the people she's led. She's worked harder than you can imagine, harder than anyone in this store. Simmons chuckled under his breath, tilting his head as if considering her words, before shaking his head like he was humoring a stubborn child. Cute speech, he said lightly, his grin sharp. But I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't add up. Your mom's probably a good woman. I'll give you that. But Special Forces? That's a man's game. Kid? Always has been. The last words hung in the air like smoke, curling around the crowd until even those who'd been whispering fell silent, their eyes flicking between Simmons and Jada, sensing that something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface of a simple argument. Maya's cheeks flushed with anger, her hands balling into fists at her sides as she snapped. That's not fair. You don't even know her mom. But Simmons only shrugged, unbothered, his confidence unshaken, feeding on the crowd's silence like oxygen. Fair? He said, leaning slightly forward, his voice lower now but still sharp enough to cut. Life's not fair, sweetheart. Reality isn't about what sounds nice. It's about what's true. And the truth is, her story doesn't make sense. He turned back to Jada, his gaze direct, cold, almost daring her to keep defending herself. But hey, he added with a mocking chuckle, if she's really out there leading classified missions and doing all this superhero stuff you claim, where is she right now? Huh? Where's this big, bad general to back you up? The words dug deep, heavier than before, and for a split second Jada felt her strength falter, the sting of shame threatening to swallow her whole. But then she remembered the promise her mother made her every night before deployment. Your truth is enough. Jada, never let anyone take it from you. She stood a little straighter, even though her knees trembled beneath her, her fingers tightening around the shoebox until her nails pressed against the cardboard. She's busy, Jada said softly but firmly, her chin lifting just slightly. She's working, because that's what leaders do. But she's real, and you'll see. Simmons laughed outright this time, the sound sharp, harsh, designed to humiliate, and several people in the crowd joined him, not cruelly, not all of them, but uncomfortably, as though pulled into his orbit by authority they didn't want to challenge. Maya stepped even closer, protective, whispering urgently, Jada, please, let's just walk away. But Jada shook her head, her breath unsteady, yet her resolve tightening like a knot in her chest. Because leaving now would feel like surrender, like telling every person watching that Simmons was right. And that was a truth she could not live with. The murmurs around them grew louder, and someone whispered, This is getting intense. As a young woman in yoga pants quietly started recording from the corner of the aisle, another man near the tent displays frowned, shaking his head as though wishing someone would intervene. But no one did. Not yet. Simmons, sensing his dominance in the moment, tilted his head and softened his voice into something almost patronizing, a feigned kindness that only made the insult sharper. Look, kid, he said, gesturing vaguely to the store around them. You don't have to lie to impress people. It's okay to have a regular mom. There's nothing wrong with that. But these little stories, these fantasies, they set you up for disappointment when reality hits. Jada felt the words like stones stacking on her chest, heavy and suffocating. But somewhere deep inside her, anger began to spark, quiet but steady, rising against the shame trying to bury her. She thought of every deployment letter, every medal polished late at night, every time her mom called home from halfway across the world just to tell her she loved her. And suddenly the heat on her face wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was fire. She looked up at Simmons, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but blazing with something stronger underneath. "You're wrong," she said softly, her voice carrying farther than she expected, stopping a few of the whispers in their tracks. "You don't get to tell me who my mom is. You don't get to decide what's true just because you don't believe it." Simmons froze for just a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the quiet force in her words, but recovered quickly, smirking as he replied, "We'll see about that. Kid, we'll see." And as his voice echoed in the hushed tension of the store, the crowd waited, holding its collective breath, unaware that in just moments, everything they thought they knew about this argument, and about the woman at the center of it, was about to change forever. The air inside the REI store felt heavy now, charged with an invisible tension that clung to every breath, and Jada Carter stood frozen, clutching the shoebox against her chest as though it were a shield, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the hum of voices around her. Maya Evans still stood close, her hand resting protectively on Jada's arm, but her wide, worried eyes darted between the growing crowd and Derek Simmons, who leaned casually against a rack of backpacks as if he owned the moment, his smirk stretching wider each time Jada dared to speak. The crowd had swelled to nearly 24 now, a mix of shoppers and curious passers-by, some whispering quietly, others recording openly, their phones capturing every second of this humiliation. And still, no one stepped in, no one stopped him, no one defended her, and that silence wrapped tighter around Jada like a vice. Simmons crossed his arms and sighed dramatically, his voice deliberately loud enough to reach the far corners of the store as he said, "I've worked with real soldiers. Kid, men and women who've bled for this country. And trust me, your little bedtime story doesn't line up." And he chuckled to himself, clearly enjoying the role he'd cast himself in. The authority figure setting the record straight for a child who didn't know better. Jada's throat burned as she tried to hold her composure, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "Your truth is enough, Jada. Never let anyone take it from you." But each time Simmons laughed, each time someone in the crowd whispered, that truth felt more fragile, as though the weight of his disbelief might crush it entirely. Maya leaned closer, whispering urgently, "Jada, please, let's just go outside. We don't need this." But Jada shook her head, her braids brushing her cheeks, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "I can't. He doesn't get to decide who she is." Simmons heard her, tilted his head, and scoffed. "Sweetheart, I'm not deciding anything. I'm just calling it like I see it. And I see a kid making up stories to impress her friends. Because let's be real, if your mom's this so-called major general, she'd be here proving it, wouldn't she?" The words hit harder than he knew, landing like stones in Jada's chest. But she stood her ground even as her knees trembled beneath her. Maya squeezed her arm, but Jada's chin lifted slightly, her voice small yet steady when she whispered, "She's coming." Simmons laughed outright this time, shaking his head as though mocking her courage itself. And that sound, the sharp, cutting sound of his amusement, hung in the air for only a moment before something shifted in the energy of the room. The sliding glass doors at the front of the REI store hissed open, and a subtle hush rolled through the crowd like a ripple across still water. Unnoticed at first by Simmons, but felt immediately by everyone else as a figure stepped into view. Boots struck the tiled floor in a measured rhythm. Steady, deliberate, unhurried. Each footfall carrying a weight of quiet authority that silenced voices mid-sentence. And shoppers instinctively stepped aside without being asked, their bodies reacting before their minds even processed why. Major General Lauren Carter had arrived, still in full camouflage uniform, fresh from a classified briefing at Fort Moore, her stars gleaming faintly under the store's overhead lights, the subdued green and tan fabric clinging neatly to her tall, commanding frame, her beret tucked crisply under her left arm. And though she said nothing yet, though her expression was calm, the sheer presence she carried wrapped the space in an instant silence so complete it made the hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly noticeable. Jada saw her first, her wide brown eyes filling with both relief and dread, because this was the moment she had prayed for, but also feared. The moment her mother would see everything, the mocking, the crowd, the humiliation, and she didn't know whether she wanted to run into her mother's arms or hide behind the display of hiking boots. Maya gasped softly, tugging at Jada's sleeve, whispering, "Oh my God, she's here." But Jada couldn't move, rooted to the spot as Lauren's gaze swept across the store, sharp and assessing, her deep brown eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the scene in seconds. The trembling daughter clutching a shoebox, the smirking officer leaning against the display, the ring of onlookers recording every angle like vultures circling a story. Lauren Carter didn't need words to command a room. Her presence was enough. The kind forged over 25 years leading elite teams through missions in places most Americans had never heard of. The kind that spoke without speaking, that demanded respect without raising a voice. And as she approached, the quiet parted around her like air shifting before a storm. Simmons finally noticed the change, straightening slightly as he caught the faint reflection of camouflage in the glass behind the crowd. He turned lazily at first, expecting another curious shopper, maybe a nosy parent. But when his eyes landed on her rank insignia, his smirk faltered, just for a split second, before he caught himself and forced it back into place, doubling down on the confidence that had carried him this far, unwilling to back down in front of the crowd he'd been performing for. "Can I help you?" "Ma'am?" he asked lightly, his tone pitched as though this were some misunderstanding. But Lauren didn't answer him immediately, instead placing a steady hand on Jada's shoulder, grounding her, reassuring her without a word. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, quiet even, yet threaded with a steel edge that silenced the last of the whispers around them. "Jada," she said softly, her eyes fixed on her daughter's flushed face. "What happened?" Jada hesitated, glancing toward Simmons, her lips trembling slightly as she opened them to speak. But Simmons jumped in first, chuckling like he had the upper hand. "Oh, nothing serious. Ma'am, just a little confusion. Kids make up stories all the time. And your daughter here." Lauren's gaze cut to him mid-sentence, sharp and unwavering, and the words caught in his throat as though someone had flipped a switch inside him, forcing silence where there had been smugness moments ago. She didn't raise her voice, didn't move closer, didn't so much as lift an eyebrow, but something in the weight of her stare, in the quiet authority radiating from her, stripped the arrogance from his posture as though peeling layers away. The crowd leaned in collectively, holding their breath, sensing they were about to witness something rare, something powerful. And for the first time since this started, Jada felt the humiliation in her chest loosen just slightly, replaced by a spark of vindication she barely dared to hope for. Lauren shifted her gaze briefly to the onlookers, scanning the ring of phones pointed in her direction, before turning back to Simmons, her tone measured, even, but carrying a quiet force beneath it. "I believe my daughter said I'm in the U.S. Army Special Forces. Do you have a reason for calling her a liar? The question hung in the silence like a challenge, not shouted but sharp enough to make Simmons's jaw tighten, his tongue pressing against his cheek as he tried to find an answer. And yet none came. The weight of her words, the undeniable truth stitched into every patch of her uniform, left little room for the arrogance he'd worn like armor moments ago. But still, he hesitated, unwilling to concede in front of the crowd, clinging to the last threads of authority he thought he had. Behind him, one of the college students whispered audibly, "Oh, this is about to get good," earning a sharp elbow from her friend to quiet down. And somewhere near the front, a woman holding a toddler muttered softly, "That's her mom," as though the reality of Lauren's presence was only just sinking in. Jada's grip on the shoebox loosened slightly as she exhaled, the tiniest hint of a smile threatening at the corner of her lips. Because finally, after what felt like hours of standing alone, she wasn't alone anymore, and the shift in the room was undeniable now. The crowd, once leaning toward Simmons's side out of assumption, now leaned silently toward hers, drawn to the quiet, commanding certainty embodied in the woman standing before them. Simmons cleared his throat, straightening his posture as though trying to reclaim ground he'd already lost, forcing a laugh that came out thinner than before. "Look, I wasn't calling anyone a liar. All right? I just thought the kid was exaggerating. That's all. No disrespect intended," he said carefully. But Lauren's gaze didn't waver, her stillness carrying more power than shouting ever could. And even without raising her voice, the message was clear to everyone watching. This confrontation wasn't over, not by a long shot, and the man who had started it was about to realize just how wrong he had been. For a moment, the REI store was silent, thick with anticipation. The crowd's collective breath held as though the air itself had stilled in the wake of Major General Lauren Carter's arrival. Jada Carter stood close to her mother, still clutching the shoebox in trembling hands, her chest rising and falling rapidly. But she felt safer now, anchored by the quiet, commanding presence beside her, while Maya Evans squeezed her shoulder softly, whispering, "It's okay. She's here now." Though her wide eyes stayed locked on Derek Simmons, who shifted slightly under the weight of Lauren's unblinking gaze. Simmons tried to force a smirk, straightening his posture as if he still held the upper hand. But his voice betrayed him with the faintest crack when he spoke. "Ma'am, this is just a misunderstanding. All right? I didn't mean any harm," he said, gesturing vaguely at Jada, as though brushing the entire scene aside. But Lauren's stillness carried more weight than his excuses, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder, grounding her as she responded in a voice that was calm, controlled, yet sharp enough to cut through the buzzing tension in the room. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated softly, each syllable deliberate, measured. "My daughter said I'm in special forces, and you laughed in her face, mocked her, dismissed her in front of strangers. Tell me, Officer Simmons, what part of that sounds like a misunderstanding to you?" The use of his name and his title landed like a gavel in a courtroom, pulling subtle gasps from the crowd, and Simmons's jaw tightened as he opened his mouth to reply. But Lauren raised a single hand slightly, silencing him before a sound escaped. She wasn't angry in the way most people understood anger. She didn't shout, didn't shake, didn't match volume with volume. But there was a controlled fire behind her steady voice, the kind born from years of commanding elite teams in life and death situations. And that quiet intensity drew everyone in, forcing them to lean closer rather than pull away. "You stood here," she continued, her eyes locked on Simmons, "and you decided my daughter's words didn't matter because they didn't fit your idea of what's possible, because when she said Major General, you heard impossible. Not because of her age, not because of her tone, But because of me. Simmons shifted uncomfortably, his fingers flexing against his folded arms. The first hint of guilt flickering across his features even as he tried to maintain his authority. With respect. Ma'am, I never mentioned race. I never. You didn't have to. Lauren cut in, her voice low but resonant, a subtle edge threading each word. Your laugh said it for you. The crowd stirred at that. Several people exchanging knowing looks, and somewhere near the back, someone whispered softly, "She's right." Though Simmons didn't turn to see who had spoken, instead, his gaze darted briefly to the circle of phones recording the moment from multiple angles, the realization dawning slowly that every word, every shift of expression was being captured, preserved, judged, not just by the people in the store, but by whoever would eventually see this footage beyond these walls. I've spent 25 years serving this country, Lauren said, her tone steady but heavy with meaning. Leading soldiers in missions most of you will never hear about, making decisions in places that will never make the news. And I've earned every star, every stripe, every ounce of respect I carry on this uniform. But none of that protects my daughter from people like you deciding, in one glance, what's believable and what isn't. Simmons swallowed hard, his bravado thinning beneath the weight of her words. His earlier arrogance replaced now with a flicker of something quieter, something closer to shame. But pride held him upright, unwilling to retreat fully. I was just surprised, he muttered finally, his voice softer, almost defensive. You don't see a lot of women. He stopped himself mid-sentence, realizing too late that the implication had already escaped. But Lauren seized the moment, her chin lifting slightly as she stepped forward, closing the space between them by a fraction, her boots landing with a measured, deliberate weight that drew the crowd even tighter around them. Women? She repeated, her voice calm but edged with steel. Or black women? Officer Simmons? Which is it? The question sliced cleanly through the silence, and Simmons's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his eyes dropping momentarily before flicking back up, trying to muster a defense that refused to come. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their earlier curiosity now replaced with quiet unease, as though watching a mirror reflect something deeper, something systemic, something they'd all seen but never named aloud. Jada looked up at her mother, pride swelling in her chest now, her humiliation fading slowly under the weight of Lauren's unshaken composure. And Maya whispered under her breath, "She's destroying him." Though neither Jada nor Lauren reacted, their focus entirely fixed on the man who had started this. Simmons finally exhaled sharply, running a hand across his jaw as though trying to wipe away the tension gathering there. His voice quieter now when he spoke, stripped of some of its earlier bite. Look, I didn't mean to hurt her feelings. All right? I just didn't think it was true. Lauren nodded slowly, the faintest movement, acknowledging his words without softening her stance. Not true to you, she clarified, her voice patient but unyielding. Because your idea of truth has limits, and my daughter didn't fit inside them. She paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment, allowing her words to settle deep, not just into Simmons, but into everyone listening. Before she continued, this time addressing the crowd as much as the man before her. How many times do we do this? She asked softly, scanning the faces around her, her tone no longer sharp but almost reflective, resonant in a different way. How many times do we hear someone's truth, someone's experience, and decide it doesn't matter because it doesn't match what we expect to see? How many voices get silenced before they've even finished speaking? The question hung there, unanswered, and for the first time since the confrontation began. Several people in the crowd lowered their phones, their expressions shifting as though re-evaluating not just this moment, but countless others like it. Simmons shifted again, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before returning to hers. His voice rougher now, less certain. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said, though even he seemed to realize how hollow it sounded compared to the weight of what had already unfolded. Lauren studied him for a long, quiet moment, her face unreadable, then said simply, "It's already gone this far. Officer Simmons, the only thing you control now is where it goes next." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to hum. Every shopper, every bystander, every camera waiting for his response. But Simmons had none. He stood there, still as stone, his shoulders drawn tight, his earlier confidence stripped away, leaving only the uncomfortable realization of how much had changed in just a few minutes. Jada's hand, still clutching the shoebox, relaxed slightly, the tension in her small frame easing as she leaned subtly into her mother's side, her chest rising with the first steady breath she'd taken since this began. And Lauren rested a hand gently against her back, steady, protective, grounding, before turning back to the man who had mocked her daughter's truth and said softly, evenly, "I suggest you choose your next words carefully. Officer." For a long moment, no one in the REI store moved, the silence so thick it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Every eye locked on Officer Derek Simmons, as if waiting for gravity itself to pull him down. He stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling unevenly beneath the weight of dozens of stares and the quiet authority radiating from Major General Lauren Carter, whose presence filled the space without effort. Her camouflage uniform a quiet reminder of the 25 years she had spent earning every ounce of respect he had just tried to strip from her daughter. Jada Carter stood pressed gently against her mother's side, her small hand still gripping the shoebox, but loosening now, her shoulders easing as the tide shifted, the humiliation she'd endured beginning to lift, replaced slowly by something warmer, something steadier, vindication. Maya Evans glanced at her best friend and whispered softly, "He's done," her voice barely audible. But Jada didn't reply, her wide brown eyes locked on Simmons. Waiting for the apology she wasn't sure he had the courage to give. The crowd had grown even larger now. Nearly 30 people gathered around the aisle, a ring of phones lifted, their tiny screens glowing like silent witnesses, capturing every second of a moment that was no longer private, no longer contained within the walls of this store. And Simmons finally seemed to realize it too, his gaze flicking briefly toward the nearest phone before darting back to Lauren, his pride battling the weight of exposure pressing hard against his chest. "Officer Simmons," Lauren said finally, her voice low and even, each syllable deliberate, cutting cleanly through the tension like a scalpel. "My daughter told you the truth, and you dismissed her, you mocked her, and you humiliated her in front of strangers. You didn't just doubt her, you decided, without knowing a single thing about me, who I could or could not be. You made a choice. Now, you have another one." Her words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the crowd, and Simmons shifted uncomfortably, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, his voice quieter now when he finally spoke, stripped of its earlier arrogance. I didn't mean to humiliate anyone," he muttered, his tone shaky as he searched for footing that no longer existed. I didn't think it was true." Lauren's gaze stayed steady, her voice soft but unyielding. "Not true to you," she said, repeating the phrase like a lesson she intended to carve into his memory. "Because your idea of truth has limits, Officer Simmons, and when my daughter's words didn't fit inside them, you decided they weren't worth believing, you laughed, and the whole store followed you." Simmons winced at that, his eyes darting briefly toward the small cluster of college students holding up their phones, their expressions sharp, critical, their whispers not quiet enough to hide judgment. His shoulders slumped slightly, his hands twitching nervously at his sides, and for the first time since this confrontation began, his voice cracked when he spoke again. "I was wrong," he said simply, his words carrying a weight that surprised even him. "I shouldn't have laughed. I shouldn't have assumed." Lauren didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let him retreat so easily. "Say it to her," she said softly, tilting her head toward Jada, her tone even but commanding. And Simmons turned, hesitating only briefly before lowering himself slightly to Jada's eye level, his voice unsteady but audible. "Jada, I'm sorry," he said, his words halting but sincere now, stripped of the false bravado he'd carried minutes ago. "I didn't believe you, and that was wrong. I made you feel small when you were telling the truth, and you didn't deserve that." Jada blinked, her lips parting slightly as though trying to process the moment, and after a long pause she nodded, not smiling, not forgiving outright, but acknowledging his words with a quiet strength her mother had taught her. And the crowd, silent until now, shifted softly, their collective energy changing like air after a storm. A man in a baseball cap near the back spoke up suddenly, his deep voice breaking the silence. "Takes guts to admit you're wrong, officer," he said evenly, his tone neither mocking nor congratulatory, just factual. And a few murmurs of agreement followed, rippling through the crowd. Simmons straightened slowly, his gaze falling to the floor for a moment before returning to Lauren, who regarded him steadily, her expression unreadable as she said, "Words matter, Officer Simmons, and so do the lessons we leave behind." She turned then, addressing the crowd around them, her voice rising slightly, not loud, but carrying easily, steady and firm. "This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every child who speaks their truth and gets told it isn't enough, who gets mocked, dismissed, or silenced because their story doesn't match someone else's expectation. We have to do better than this. Every single one of us." The words hung in the air like a quiet challenge, and for a moment no one moved, no one breathed, and then a soft, unexpected sound came from near the front. A woman holding a toddler began to clap, slow, deliberate, almost tentative, and one by one, others joined her, until the gentle rhythm swelled into something fuller, a quiet acknowledgement of truth and dignity that filled the space without overpowering it. Jada felt her chest loosen completely now, her throat no longer tight, her breathing easier as she leaned lightly into her mother's side. And Maya whispered again, this time with a small smile. "Told you she'd handle it." Simmons stood quietly, his shoulders lower now, his earlier swagger stripped entirely away, his expression sober as he nodded once toward Lauren, a small gesture of acknowledgement that carried no defense, no excuse, just understanding. Lauren inclined her head slightly in return, her hand resting gently against Jada's back as she said softly to her daughter, "You stood tall today. I hope you know that." And Jada nodded, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile, her voice quiet but steady when she whispered back, "I tried." "Mama," Lauren smiled faintly, squeezing her shoulder gently. And though the tension in the room had eased, the weight of the moment lingered, leaving an imprint on everyone who had witnessed it. The quiet, commanding dignity of a woman who didn't need to shout to command respect. The courage of a young girl who refused to back down even when the world tried to shrink her. And the sobering reminder of how quickly prejudice can surface, even in the smallest, most ordinary places. For Simmons, it was a reckoning, a public moment of accountability he hadn't expected but couldn't escape. And though his apology couldn't erase the sting of his words, it planted the seed of something deeper, something that might change him in ways he hadn't yet begun to understand. For Jada, it was vindication, proof that her truth mattered, proof that her voice had weight, and as she stood surrounded by strangers who had witnessed her strength, she realized something quietly powerful. Sometimes, the biggest battles aren't fought on distant battlefields. They're fought right here, in the places where dignity meets doubt, and courage decides the outcome. The REI store had grown almost unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made every sound, the faint hum of overhead lights, the soft shuffling of shoes, the quiet breathing of those standing closest. Feel amplified. Jada Carter stood beside her mother, still holding the shoebox loosely against her chest. Her wide brown eyes focused on Major General Lauren Carter as though anchoring herself in her presence, while Maya Evans stood close, her hand resting protectively on Jada's shoulder, her own expression a mixture of awe and relief. Officer Derek Simmons shifted slightly a few feet away, his arms no longer folded, his posture no longer commanding, his once confident smirk replaced by something quieter, humbled, though his gaze remained low, avoiding the ring of phones still capturing every second of this moment. Lauren turned slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd gathered around her, their faces reflecting everything from unease to admiration. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried softly, yet filled every corner of the store. Steady, deliberate, unshaken. "This isn't just about my daughter," she said, letting her words roll carefully into the silence. "And it's not just about Officer Simmons either. This is about every single person who's ever spoken their truth and been told it doesn't matter. About every child who's ever been laughed at when they should have been believed. About every voice that was silenced before it even had the chance to be heard." Her tone wasn't angry now. It was something deeper, something resonant that drew the crowd closer. Not physically, but emotionally, making them lean in without realizing it. Her gaze swept across the small sea of faces, lingering briefly on the woman with a toddler, on the college students clutching their phones, on the man in the baseball cap, before returning to her daughter, who stood silently, her expression soft but steady. "Do you know how many times my daughter has had to explain who I am?" Lauren continued, her voice lowering slightly, as though speaking directly to them rather than at them. "How many times she's been doubted, dismissed, questioned, not because of what she says, but because of who we are? I've served this country for 25 years. I've led missions in places most people can't pronounce. I've trained soldiers who would follow me anywhere without hesitation. But none of that stopped my 13-year-old daughter from standing here today and being called a liar in front of strangers." Her voice tightened slightly on the last words, just enough for the emotion beneath the surface to break through. And Jada glanced up at her, blinking quickly as though fighting back tears she didn't want anyone to see. Lauren placed a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her, before turning her attention back to the room. "Respect costs nothing," she said softly, pausing just long enough to let the words settle into the silence. "And yet its absence can take everything. Dignity, confidence, the belief that your voice matters. When you take that from someone, especially a child, you leave scars you don't always see." There was movement in the crowd then, subtle but noticeable. The lowering of a few phones, the shifting of weight as people glanced at one another, realizing perhaps for the first time that this wasn't just about them witnessing a confrontation, but about them being part of something larger. Lauren's tone softened further, her voice calm but firm. "We can do better than this. All of us." It's easy to dismiss someone when their story doesn't fit your picture of the world, but maybe that's when you need to listen the most. Her eyes drifted briefly to Simmons, whose expression had shifted completely now, his gaze fixed on the floor, his earlier arrogance stripped away like old paint, leaving something raw beneath it. She didn't call him out again. Didn't need to. The quiet weight of accountability already sat heavy on his shoulders, and everyone could see it. "I've spent years leading soldiers into situations where trust was the only thing keeping us alive. she continued, her voice carrying now with a rare force. And the thing about trust is, it starts small, in moments like these, in conversations like this one, in deciding whether to believe someone when they tell you who they are, when we fail at that, when we fail each other here, we fail out there too. A few nods rippled subtly through the crowd, the man in the baseball cap murmuring something under his breath that sounded like agreement, and the woman holding the toddler adjusted her child on her hip, her expression softening with quiet understanding. Jada, still silent, finally shifted slightly, straightening her small shoulders as though her mother's words were building her up from the inside out, replacing the sting of humiliation with something sturdier. Pride, Lauren noticed, resting her hand gently against her back before continuing, her voice quieter now, more intimate, as though speaking to her daughter as much as to everyone else. You stood tall today, Jada. Even when it was hard, you told the truth, and you didn't let anyone take that from you. Jada blinked quickly, her lips curling faintly into a small, almost shy smile, and Maya leaned closer to whisper softly, "See? I told you. She's amazing." Earning a tiny laugh from Jada that broke just enough tension to make the moment breathe again. Lauren turned back to the crowd, her tone settling into something measured, reflective, like a closing note at the end of a long and complicated song. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to leave behind for them? She gestured gently toward Jada, toward the toddler perched on her mother's hip, toward the younger faces scattered among the shoppers, her voice soft but carrying weight, one where their voices are met with disbelief and mockery, or one where they're heard, where their stories are honored, where we believe in possibilities bigger than our assumptions. A beat of silence followed, long enough for the meaning to land, and somewhere in the crowd, a young woman whispered softly, "Amen," almost unconsciously, drawing a ripple of quiet agreement from a few others nearby. Simmons finally lifted his gaze, his face pale but his expression open now, stripped of defensiveness, his earlier armor gone entirely as he nodded faintly, as though finally hearing what he should have understood all along. And Lauren met his eyes briefly, not with anger, but with something more complicated. Disappointment. Yes, but also a quiet hope that maybe this moment would be enough to shift him, to teach him something lasting. "Next time you doubt someone," she said softly, her voice lowering to a near whisper that somehow still reached every corner of the space. "Ask yourself why, and choose respect. Even if you don't understand, it costs you nothing, and it could mean everything." The stillness that followed was different now. Not tense, but reverent. The kind of silence that carries weight without heaviness. And as Lauren gently rested her beret under her arm, the crowd seemed to breathe collectively again, some smiling faintly, others thoughtful, many lowering their phones entirely, sensing instinctively that what they were witnessing was no longer just a confrontation, but a lesson, one they'd carry with them long after leaving the store. Jada leaned into her mother's side, her small voice quiet but steady when she whispered, "Mama, I'm glad you came." And Lauren smiled softly, lowering her head just enough to murmur back, "So am I. Baby, so am I." The energy inside the REI store had shifted completely, the heavy tension replaced by something quieter, calmer, as if the room itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Shoppers began to drift back toward the aisles, murmuring softly to one another. But many lingered near the entrance, stealing glances at Jada Carter and her mother as though they couldn't quite pull themselves away from what they had witnessed. A moment that had begun as humiliation, but transformed into something far greater. Jada stood close to Major General Lauren Carter, her small shoulders finally relaxed, the shoebox now dangling loosely at her side, but her wide brown eyes carried a different weight than they had minutes earlier. Not the weight of shame, but of understanding, of a new kind of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Maya Evans, still at her side, smiled gently, giving her a soft nudge as she whispered, "You were amazing." And for the first time since it began, Jada allowed herself to smile back. A small, quiet smile, but one that carried relief, pride, and a spark of something brighter she couldn't yet name. As they walked slowly toward the sliding glass doors, Lauren resting a hand lightly against her daughter's back. Jada glanced up at her mother and finally broke the silence between them, her voice low, uncertain. "Mama, why did he laugh at me like that? He didn't even know us." Lauren glanced down, her steps measured, her expression softening as she responded gently. "Because sometimes, baby, people decide what's possible based on what they've already seen, and when they can't picture something, they tell themselves it isn't real. It's easier to doubt than to believe." Jada thought about that quietly as they walked, her small hands tightening briefly around the shoebox before relaxing again, her voice softer when she asked, "Did I do the right thing? Not walking away?" Lauren smiled faintly, stopping just inside the doorway to crouch slightly so they were eye to eye, the low hum of shoppers passing around them fading as she said softly, "You stood up for the truth. Jada, you stood tall when it would have been easier to shrink. And that's something most grown people can't even do. You were brave today, and I am proud of you." Jada swallowed hard, blinking quickly as though holding back tears she didn't want anyone else to see. And Maya reached over, squeezing her friend's hand with a small, reassuring nod, grounding her further in the moment. Behind them, Officer Derek Simmons lingered near the backpack display, his expression distant now, no longer defensive but reflective. His posture slouched slightly as though the weight of the encounter had settled deep into his chest. He glanced once toward Jada, as if considering saying more, but thought better of it, remaining quiet, perhaps understanding that some lessons are better carried in silence than explained with words. As they stepped outside the store, the late afternoon sunlight spilled across the marble floor of Lenox Square Mall, warm and golden, and Jada paused just beyond the threshold, closing her eyes briefly and taking a slow, deep breath, as though exhaling the last of the sting she had carried since Simmons's laughter first echoed through the aisles. Lauren placed a steady hand on her shoulder, her voice low and even. "You know, baby, what happened in there wasn't just about you or me. It was about everyone watching, too. Sometimes the lesson isn't just for the person who doubts. It's for the people standing nearby, deciding whether to speak up, deciding whether to believe." Jada nodded slowly, her voice thoughtful now, softer but steadier. "So, maybe next time. They'll listen first." Lauren smiled faintly, brushing a loose braid gently from her daughter's cheek, her tone warm but firm. "Maybe they will, and maybe next time. Someone else will stand tall because they saw you do it today." Those words sank deep into Jada's heart as they began walking again, weaving through clusters of shoppers heading in every direction, the soft hum of weekend chatter surrounding them but somehow feeling distant now. Maya skipped lightly to keep pace, chattering quietly about grabbing ice cream before heading home, trying to lighten the moment. And Jada smiled faintly at the thought. But her mind kept drifting back to the circle of faces in the store. The phones, the whispers, the weight of being seen and doubted all at once. And she realized something important. This wasn't just about proving her mother's rank. It was about proving something to herself, that her voice mattered, even when it trembled, even when the world tried to make her doubt it. Lauren, sensing her daughter's quiet, glanced down briefly and said softly, "There will be more moments like this. Jada. Not always this public. Not always this loud. But there will be times when people question you, when they doubt what you know to be true, and when that happens. I want you to remember today. Jada looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. Remember what? Lauren smiled faintly, her gaze steady as she said. Remember that you didn't back down. Remember that you are enough, even when someone else can't see it. Your truth doesn't need permission to exist. The words landed deeply, warm and grounding, and Jada felt something inside her settle, like a puzzle piece locking into place, her chest loosening with a quiet confidence she hadn't felt before. As they neared the mall's glass entrance, Maya darted ahead, holding the door open with an exaggerated bow that finally drew a soft laugh from Jada, breaking the last of the tension clinging to her shoulders. The three of them stepped outside into the golden light, the late August air warm but soft against their skin. And for a brief moment, Jada tilted her face toward the sunlight, letting the glow wash over her like a promise of new beginnings. Behind them, through the glass doors, a few of the shoppers who had witnessed the entire confrontation watched silently as Lauren and Jada walked away. Some with thoughtful expressions, others with quiet smiles, carrying pieces of the lesson with them as they dispersed back into the flow of their ordinary afternoons. The videos recorded that day would eventually find their way online, spreading beyond the walls of Lenox Square, sparking conversations about respect, truth, and the quiet power of standing tall. But for Jada, none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the shoebox in her hand, the warmth of her mother's steady presence beside her, and the knowledge that she had faced something hard and come out stronger on the other side. As they reached the parking lot, Lauren unlocked the car and glanced briefly at her daughter through the reflection of the window, her voice soft but certain as she said, "Today, you learned what I've spent my whole career teaching others. Real strength isn't about rank or stars or uniforms. It's about knowing who you are when someone else tries to tell you who you can't be." Jada met her mother's gaze in the glass, her voice quiet but sure when she whispered back, "I know who I am, Mama." And as they slid into the car, the hum of Atlanta traffic buzzing softly in the distance, Jada realized that what happened inside that store would stay with her forever, not as a wound, but as a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are fought in the smallest places, and that courage, once claimed, cannot be taken back. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. Your voice matters, and your support helps us share more powerful stories. See you in the next one.